Who are some women that often get overlooked in history but had major contributions to society? Dr. Mona HannaAtisha. She is the Dean of Medicine at Hurley Children's Hospital in Flint, Michigan. She saw that children were having elevated lead levels, ELLs, outside the normal range. She contacted the Genesee Department of Health, who at first dismissed her claim, then sent her obfuscated data to make it look like the ELLs were completely within normal trends. She grew frustrated at this, so she called a team of epidemiologists from UVA, her alma mater, to find the source of the lead. Lo and behold, she found that the water in multiple zip codes was contaminated with lead. She informed the Genesee Department of Health again, who brushed her off. She then said F it and held a major press conference where she announced on air that the water in Flint wasn't safe and to come to the hospital to get your child tested and to pick up supplies of water and liquid infant formula. If she saved thousands of children from the permanent effects of lead poisoning. Edit 1, thanks for the awards. Edit 2, it was VT, not UVA. Apologies to all the VT alumni who direct messaged me about it. I was just reading about her yesterday. She's also helped design ways to assist parents who have children with lead poisoning as well. I've met her. She works really closely with my alma mater, Michigan State. A truly fantastic human. And as if this wasn't enough, back in March she had COVID and after she recovered began donating blood as often as she could so they could use it in antibody and vaccine research. Marie Tharp. She created the first map of the ocean floor, which led to the discovery of tectonic plates, and the theory of continental drift. That doesn't seem like a lot on the surface, but that really had major impacts on our society. That's because it wasn't on the surface. It was the ocean floor. Slaps knee. Inka Mueller was a Danish seismologist. She discovered P waves, waves that reflect off of the inner core, confirming that the Earth has a solid inner core and a liquid outer core. Yes, was just about to comment her as well. It's shocking she's not better known. I mean, most people don't know any famous geologists. I'd reckon that most geology/geophysics students have heard of her. Frances Oldham Kelly. She stopped thalidomide from getting widespread use in North America, and saved countless children from life-altering birth defects. Edit, Kelsey, not Kelly. This is so cool. I had a high school English teacher who was a thalidomide baby. She was very traditionally beautiful, but her right arm was tiny with only 3 fingers. Not that it ever slowed her down. She was right-handed and wrote with a 3-fingered hand. She was, and still is, one of the most extraordinary, outgoing, dynamic, talented and intelligent people I've ever met. She made a massive impact on so many students in her life. Edit, by the way, I don't mean to diminish Frances Oldham Kelly's impact just because my teacher was one of the more fortunate thalidomide victims. I'm sure my teacher would be the first to sing Kelly's praises from the rooftops. I know this is cliché, but you should think about sending that teacher a message, and letting her know how much she is appreciated. That's a wonderful recommendation. I'm friends with her on Facebook and correspond with her often, and she's a highly lauded person in the community where I grew up. But regardless, it's always nice to reiterate that appreciation, every little bit is well deserved for both her and less appreciated educators. Absolute legend. Got hired because they thought she was a man, Frances. Edit, to be clear, it wasn't the FDA who thought she was male. It was her first appointment at the pharmacology department at the University of Chicago where they thought she was a man. I also have a male first name, despite being a woman, and work in medicine. It definitely helps, sadly. I used a male nickname for myself when I worked in an email-only support position working around the world virtually. It worked so much better than when I first started with my female name. With a male name they never asked for my supervisor or for a second opinion. It's really rough to be a woman in business, and that was honestly just the lightest slight that could happen. Use it to your advantage every chance you get. Thalidomide is a great example to explain the importance of stereochemistry. The prototypical example. For anyone interested, web link. Such a badass. After hearing about her on a podcast, I did a deeper dive. In 1952, Dr. Virginia Ogar developed a quick, easy 5-point test that summarizes health of newborns and determine those needing emergency assistance. The Ogar score is now given to practically every newborn and helps save countless young lives and reduce infant mortality. Fun fact: I edited her Wikipedia page to include her cause of death. I was in a summer program about women's history, and one morning we were asked to edit a famous woman's wiki page to contribute to more accurate and full info about their lives, because that's not a thing that many people are invested in. So if you get to the part where she died of cirrhosis, that was me. Edit. Thanks for the awards and karma. I did not expect to wake up and see that. Yes. This was such an incredible advancement. I worked in a pediatrician's office, which led to me reading a little more about her. Amazing how little she's mentioned, but most of us are literally here because of her. We learn all about Ogar scores in nursing school, obviously, and she is fundamentally undervalued, especially if you are going into pediatrics. It's shame we didn't get more of a background on this woman and her accomplishments. Sandra Ford, the drug technician who first brought attention to what would become the AIDS epidemic. She knew something was up when she began receiving unusually high numbers of requests for pentamidine, an antibiotic reserved for treating pneumocystis pneumonia in seriously ill, immunocompromised patients. The patients it was being requested for were gay men who had been otherwise healthy. Oh, and also back then it was called GRID, not AIDS. It stood for gay-related immunodeficiency, whereas AIDS stands for acquired immunodeficiency syndrome. The more you know. And it was so effing awful how the whole thing was handled. Seriously depressing. But, for a laugh, we can remember the giant condom placed over Jesse Helms' house, because F that butthole and every other jerk who thought HIV/AIDS wasn't worth researching because it was punishment for being gay. It really is. I didn't really understand the gravity of the situation and the massive failures to act due to stigma until I watched the film and then the band played on. I highly recommend you watch it if you have any curiosity about the subject. 3 things made the epidemic particularly terrible. 1. The HIV virus has evolved to be less virulent and, depending on the strain of course, may go undetected for a very, very long time. But when it first became an epidemic, the virus was much more aggressive and killed hosts faster. 2. Stigma. This is arguably the biggest contributor, although the virulence of the virus did make a significant difference. Because AIDS, or GRID, as it was initially referred to, was heavily associated with the gay community, government leadership literally chose to do nothing or as little as possible, cause who cares about a disease that you only get from being gay? Problem there is because there was no push to research the virus, it wasn't clear among the general public that sharing needles, dirty tattoo needles, and even blood transfusions also accelerated the spread of the infection. Additionally, given that the decades prior were all about free love, etc., heterosexual people still engaged in risky behavior like unprotected sex, and somehow people didn't consider that the virus doesn't care about your orientation, so that won't protect you either. Especially with the aforementioned blood-borne routes of transmission. 3. Antivirals. Even though antivirals began to be prescribed a bit into the crisis, doctors would only prescribe one antiviral at a time, which leads to effectiveness of drugs treating HIV/AIDS eventually dropping off because the virus mutates fast and resistance forms. Once research into the disease was properly conducted, and enough time/trial and error occurred, we learned that an antiviral's vaginatail is by far the best approach for long-term treatment because it lowers viral load quickly and to a greater extent, slowing or all but halting the acquisition of drug resistance by keeping viral load in the blood much lower overall. I thought it was particularly terrible because I spent my 20s watching my friends die. Coming of age in the late 80s, early 90s was filled with tension. We were finally beginning to properly experience sexual freedom and celebrate sexual diversity, but then sex became fraught with danger. It went from secretly desirable to what felt like a game of Russian roulette. And the misinformation spread, the judgment spread. And then we watched our friends die. Silence equals death. I worked in the performing arts most of my life, well, they still do, and I went to so many memorial services in my 20s. Memorial services for people who were not much older than I was. The one I remember the most was for the managing director of a theater that I freelanced at often. He spent the last year of his life writing his memorial service as a performance, then casting and directing it. One day we all got an invite. I've never laughed and cried so hard in my entire life. I lost my uncle, with whom I was particularly close to. I can't imagine what it was like to see all your friends die, and not know why. My deepest sympathies for your losses. I hope you're doing okay today. And before GRID, it was known as the 4-H disease because it primarily affected homosexuals, heroin users, hemophiliacs and Haitians. There's a kids farming club popular in the United States named 4-H. I've sometimes wondered whether they added Haitians to the list so they could use the 4-H designation since it was already in the lexicon. Never knew that. Thanks. Bessie Coleman. She was a black woman who wanted to learn to fly. No one would teach her. She learned that the French would, however, so she moved to France, learned French and how to fly. Then she came back to the States and taught whoever wanted to learn. She was alive same time as Amelia Earhart and got no recognition at the time. I was going to put her on glad someone did. She was a huge part of African Americans getting into flight. She played not only a role for females but for African Americans during the early days of aviation, to be able to fly and get into the aviation field. The main road that runs through the middle of O'Hare Airport is called Bessie Coleman Drive. Nellie Bly. She was a 1890s journalist who was given an assignment to investigate the women's lunatic asylum on Blackwell's Island due to accusations of the mistreatment of patients. She got in there by faking insanity and getting herself committed to the asylum, and when she was finally released, she ran an expose in the New York World called 10 Days in a Madhouse that exposed the awful treatment of patients inside the asylum. This was considered a revolution in investigative journalism. Also, she read Around the World in 80 Days, basically decided she could do better, and went around the world in 72 days. She was also an inventor, and was one of the primary journalists to cover the suffragette movement. She's one of my favorite historical figures who doesn't get enough attention. Edit. Wow. Thank you for the awards and upvotes. I am grateful and glad to see all the positive comments. When I was a kid, we had a collection of illustrated books about different historical figures. The one on Nellie Bly was always one of my favorites. I just read through. She led an interesting life. She went on to marry a millionaire and inherited a fortune, only to have the company go bankrupt due to her negligence and a corrupt factory manager. Web link. Only to have the company go bankrupt due to her negligence and a corrupt factory manager. Brother, what? From the Wikipedia article, she ran her company as a model of social welfare, replete with health benefits and recreational facilities. But Bly was hopeless at understanding the financial aspects of her business and ultimately lost everything. Unscrupulous employees built the firm of hundreds of thousands of dollars, troubles compounded by a protracted and costly bankruptcy litigation. Good journalists make dreadful capitalists. Source: am mediocre journalist. So are you a mediocre capitalist? Was it the ones that always gave them an imaginary friend? I had those. There was two types. One gave them an imaginary friend, the other had some object tell their story. Loved them. My mom still has them. Sad that I only know of her through drunk history. 90% of my history education is from drunk history. I love drunk history, and if you'd like to expand your knowledge about women in history like Nellie, may I recommend the History Chicks podcast? They're fantastic and have covered Nellie and a ton of other amazing women. Highly recommend them. Abby Bartlett, is that you? But seriously, love Nellie Bly. I remember this from that Grease spin-off where Rizzo becomes the First Lady. Thank you for watching. If you like our videos, please like them on YouTube. And share them with your friends. Please subscribe to be the first to know about Red Rabbit Reader's new videos. We welcome your comments below. Another of our videos will begin shortly.